Hello and welcome to the second lecture in my series on stimulants. As you can see, this one will cover amphetamines. And following a similar course as I did in my last lecture, I'm going to address first the history of amphetamines, talk a little bit about their pharmacology, and talk about their current use before moving on to talk about some of their acute and chronic effects. Now, towards the end of the lecture, I'll talk about medical uses of stimulants, because of course there are some useful effects of these drugs, and also talk about treatment for dependence on stimulants and also amphetamines, but also including cocaine there as well. So let's get started. Now, the history of amphetamines, like the history of some of the other drugs we're going to talk about, begins with a plant. In this case, the plant is the ephedra plant, or the Ephedra vulgaris, which is native to Asia and produces a bunch of different alkaloids, including one called ephedrine. Now, among native or indigenous peoples in Asia, there's plenty of evidence dating back for thousands of years of the use of the ephedra plant. So in some traditional Indian medicine, there's reference to a substance called soma, which could be taken for medicinal purposes or spiritual purposes. In traditional Chinese medicine, there was and is the use of a plant called ma huang, which is really ephedra by a different name, for treatment of different disorders, including respiratory conditions. And so whether in ancient India or indeed in modern India or Pakistan or China, you could buy ephedra, and you might choose to take it if you have asthma or other respiratory problems, if you feel tired and need a stimulant effect. Typically, the way the drug is taken is it's boiled up in kind of a tea, or it's steeped in hot water to make a tea-like beverage, which you then consume to get the medicinal effects. Now, this is a similar, in some sense, to the way people have used coca leaves for a very long period of time, kind of in their roughly natural form. In the case of ephedra, just the dried up sticks from the ephedra plant. But as we saw with cocaine, in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, the rise of modern chemistry and pharmacology allowed for the extraction of the active alkaloids from plants to create new sort of purified versions of the drugs. In the case of the ephedra plant, it was a Japanese chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi who actually had studied both traditional Asian medicine forms, but had also trained as a chemist in Europe, who made it part of his career to find traditional medicinal plants and to extract from them, if possible, active alkaloids. And in this case, he was able to extract ephedra from the ephedrine from the ephedra plant and produce it in his laboratory. And what he was able to extract was ephedrine sulfate, which, like cocaine, is chemically speaking a salt. And because it's a salt, it's water soluble, so it can be drunk in a liquid, or it can be injected, or it can even be inhaled as a mist. Now later on, a Romanian chemist, Lazar Edelanu, I hope I get that name right, basically developed a synthetic version of ephedrine. So basically was able to build in a laboratory from reagents an identical molecule to the molecule which can be extracted from the natural ephedra plant. And he named that synthetic version amphetamine. So this is the first of a whole group of drugs which we now collectively call amphetamines. At the time, he was working for, or I'm not sure if he was working for, but shortly thereafter, the pharmaceutical company SmithKline & French, which is actually still around in some form, acquired the patent for the drug and marketed it under the name Benzedrine. So in the early part of the 20th century, if you had respiratory problems, like if you had asthma, if you had sort of bronchial congestion, you could purchase a Benzedrine inhaler like the one you see right here. It's a tube that is full of a cotton swab that's been soaked in a solution of Benzedrine. You would sort of unscrew the ends of each of the tube and then kind of draw your breath through the tube, picking up some of the mist of the Benzedrine and getting some relief, because as we'll see later in this lecture, amphetamines, like other stimulants, act as bronchodilators. You could also get similar effects if you took a tablet, like you can see here pictured also on this slide. Interestingly, there are also accounts of people from way back in the day unscrewing the inhaler tubes and just pulling out the cotton swab and eating it so as to get a really massive dose of amphetamines all at once and get high from the experience. And certainly there were people who were taking heavy doses of tablets to get similar kind of stimulant, recreational stimulant effects, we can imagine. Now, during the war years, meaning World War I and World War II, the popularity of amphetamines really increased in large part because they were given to soldiers on all sides of the war, the Axis, the Allies. Soldiers were given PEP pills, so-called, which were usually just Benzedrine in one form or another, to help decrease their fatigue, decrease their need for sleep, increase their ability to concentrate if they were on sentry duty or if they were flying a long-distance bombing mission or doing any sort of other kind of stressful, important task that would take a long time but would require a great deal of vigilance and concentration. So again, the simple fact that soldiers were given these drugs increased their popularity, generally speaking, in the whole population, both during and after the war. And there was a lot of research at that time by different companies, different pharmaceutical companies, to kind of refine the way that amphetamine was synthesized so as to create new versions of the molecule which might have better or more potent effects. So we began with Benzedrine. Benzedrine was chemically modified to make dextroamphetamine or D-amphetamine, which if you've taken a chemistry class, we might class this as like the right-handed version of a molecule, which is more potent than the left-handed version of the molecule, which is just Benzedrine. So this dextroamphetamine or D-amphetamine, or later just given the trade name Dexedrine, was basically a stronger version of amphetamine. And then after that, the Dexedrine molecule was further refined or further kind of tinkered with to create methamphetamine. And if you look very closely there at the bottom right corner, and if you remember your chemistry class maybe from high school, you'll notice that there's a methyl group in the place where formerly there was just a hydrogen molecule in Dexedrine. That methyl group actually changes the fat solubility of the molecule and helps it get absorbed into the brain faster. So as you would know already from this class, drugs which get into the brain quickly tend to have stronger and certainly quicker effects than drugs which get into the brain more slowly. Methamphetamine is more potent still than Dexedrine, which is more potent still than Benzedrine. So the story of amphetamine is that there are a variety of different drugs which we could put together under this heading. Many of them are the products of pharmaceutical and pharmacological tinkering to kind of work on the drug, enhance its effects, limit some of its side effects, etc. As I said before, kind of during and after the war years, there was widespread popularity and widespread use of amphetamines by people from really all walks of life. Businessmen, housewives, artists, workers, all sorts of folks. If you're a fan of classic rock, you may remember the early Rolling Stones song "Mother's Little Helper," which tells the story of a kind of an anxious and busy woman who ends up pleading to her doctor to get medication to help her get through her busy day. The song was almost certainly referencing the widespread use of amphetamines by people who felt anxious and stressed out and fatigued and felt like getting that extra boost of energy helped them get through their day. This is this candy container I saw online kind of references the song, which again references the drug use. But we can also find evidence of this if we look at just a magazine advertisement from that period in time. And if you do, you can find online very easily ads like these ones. So you see ads where amphetamines were advertised to men who were suffering from depression. So here's an ad for dexedrine sulfate, which would be given to someone, a guy who's feeling a bit down, a bit depressed, and wants to have kind of a new and more rich life. There were loads of ads for amphetamines for women to treat all sorts of different problems, including just general stress and fatigue, or to treat the symptoms of menopause. I realize that both of these ads have kind of poor resolution. They were the best I could find online. But if you squint closely, you can see that they're both ads for benzedrine sulfate, again, targeted towards women. More ads towards women, amphetamines for treatment of menstrual dysfunction, whatever that is. Again, if you feel uncomfortable because you're having your period or you're about to have your period, perhaps taking amphetamines would help you. Certainly you might have a doctor or pharmacist who would recommend that to you if you're a woman back in the day. Women were and are targets for a lot of advertising, including advertising for amphetamines for dieting. So you can see here 2 ads for the use of one drug, which is apetrol, which is just a dexedrine drug, I think, and ethoxine hydrochloride, which again, I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I think it's just another amphetamine back in the day for helping women to lose weight, because as we'll see, or as we saw with cocaine, and as we'll see later on in this lecture, taking amphetamines and other stimulants tends to decrease appetite. So there's a lot of advertisement towards kind of mainstream America for the use of amphetamines. There are also plenty of examples during the 50s and 60s and later on in the 20th century of artists and painters and other folks who famously used an enormous amount of stimulants. One of my favorite writers, I don't have him pictured here, but is Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher and writer who wrote a lot on amphetamines, meaning he was on amphetamines a lot when he was writing. Here pictured you can see Jack Kerouac, the American Beat Generation poet and writer, Hunter Thompson, the reporter and writer, pictured there as well, both of whom used a lot of different drugs and alcohol, but included among them was a heavy use of amphetamines for the energy that they gave them. If you were a writer, you could take a bunch of amphetamines and stay up for a very long period of time writing kind of at great speed, producing an enormous amount of text, which you might like, or your publishers and editors might like. I also didn't picture here, though I probably should have, one of my other favorite writers is the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, who you may be familiar with if you've seen the movie Minority Report or Blade Runner, or really almost any modern science fiction movie in some way or another references the work of Philip K. Dick. He used to write a lot while on amphetamines, and it's interesting to note that many of his science fiction stories have this kind of overlay of uncertainty and paranoia about them, which we'll see later on in this lecture may be the result of his amphetamine use. If you use amphetamines for a long period of time, you can get very disoriented and very paranoid. So it's possible that his writing, beyond being influenced by his own genius as a writer, was also influenced by his heavy drug use. Anyway, by the latter part of the 20th century, amphetamines were very, very popular. You see different sorts of statistics in different sources, but by about 1970, it's estimated that maybe 10% of the American population was using amphetamines, and maybe 8 or 10% or so of all prescriptions were being written for them. I mean, those are huge numbers when you think about that, just the number of prescriptions that were being written for these drugs. As often happens, though, when we look at different drugs, the popularity of a drug will increase, and over time, a greater awareness of the potential risks of using the drug will also follow. And so that was the case in kind of the latter part of the 20th century, as more and more people began to worry about the adverse effects of amphetamine use, and worry generally if they were being overused or overprescribed, if we were having an over-medicated population, and so on. And those concerns led to changes in the law that took place in the 60s and 70s. So in 1965, there were some federal drug laws that basically required pharmacists and doctors to keep better record of prescriptions that they were writing to kind of limit the amount of overprescription of these drugs. Similar laws have been enacted in more recent years to control the prescription of opioid analgesics. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. And then, as I mentioned in my last lecture, in 1970 there was the Comprehensive Drug Control Act, which created these schedules or lists that different drugs would be put on in terms of how useful they were and what sort of risks they had in terms of addiction or dependence. And it happens to be the case that amphetamines are mostly grouped on Schedule 2, meaning that they're drugs which are thought to have some medical uses, but are also pose some risks, including risk for addiction. The results of these laws greatly limited the availability of amphetamines, and generally speaking, amphetamine use declined during the 1970s and the 1980s. Although some sources that I've read argue that during the same period of decline in amphetamine use, cocaine use kind of began to increase as well, which suggests the possibility that some people who were formerly using and abusing amphetamines but were having a harder and harder time getting them switched over to using cocaine. Now, during the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was a rise in illegal laboratories where people produced their own concoctions of amphetamines, and especially methamphetamines. Probably should have included at this point in the lecture some sort of reference to the TV series Breaking Bad, which, as you almost certainly know, tells the story of a high school chemistry teacher who becomes a drug kingpin by setting up his own methamphetamine distribution lab and distribution network. That story, or that TV series, is based somewhat on truth. There were, and still are, I'm sure, but there certainly were plenty of homegrown methamphetamine labs in the 1990s. During that time period, there were a series of federal laws which limited the availability of some of the ingredients that were used commonly to make methamphetamine. So things like pseudoephedrine, which used to be easily available in cold remedies and allergy remedies. As an allergy sufferer, I remember taking a lot of Sudafed over the years when I had allergic reactions to cats or dust or things like that. I don't know how long ago it was, sometime in the late 1990s, I imagine, where pseudoephedrine became much harder to purchase in the pharmacy, and now I'm sure if you went to Walgreens or CVS, you can only buy a fairly limited amount of Sudafed or similar drugs because of laws designed to limit the availability of pseudoephedrine, which can be turned into amphetamine or methamphetamine fairly easily. Similarly, there's you can use in one of the chemical reactions to make methamphetamine anhydrous ammonia fertilizer, like would be purchased by a farmer to spray on his fields to increase crop yields. There are different laws that were enacted to limit the availability of that reagent to tamp down on the ability of homegrown meth operations to create their drugs. That had some effect in this country, but unfortunately a lot of the supply of methamphetamine has now shifted to Mexico, where drug laws are different, or certainly at least in some regions of the country less easily enforced, and large methamphetamine laboratories in Mexico are now thought to supply most of the methamphetamine that you can purchase in America. And as recently as a couple years ago, I talked to a detective in a narcotics task force here in Fargo, North Dakota, and he confirmed my suspicion and what I've read, that a lot of the meth that was found in our region of the country, the upper Midwest, was originally traced back to Mexico. So all right, that gives you a little bit of the sense of the history of amphetamines from their early use by indigenous peoples, at least in the form of ephedra, up till their kind of discovery and purification and expansion and use in a variety of different forms. Let's talk a little bit now about current use of amphetamines. How much are people generally using different sorts of amphetamines? Well, if we go to the Monitoring the Future data set, again, we're looking here at high school-aged kids or junior high and high school-aged folks. We see kind of peak use of the drug kind of in the very late 1970s and then declines through the 1980s, a little bit of a rebound in the 1990s. That's the general trend that we see with most of the drugs, and it's really not a lot different from what we saw with cocaine. It is worth noting, though, and you might only see this if you really quickly looked back to the previous lecture, that the rates of use and the perceived availability of amphetamines as compared to cocaine are about twice as much. So, the percentage of people in 12th grade who reported ever having used cocaine was, I think, down near 4 or 5% in 2014. It's a little bit closer to 10% in 2014 for amphetamines. So amphetamines, generally speaking, are just seen as more easily available and are used at least at some point by a greater percentage of high school students than was the case with cocaine. In terms of these drugs' perceived risk of use and the disapproval associated with using them, a little bit like cocaine, we see kind of a moderate to high perceived risk and a moderate to high disapproval of using these drugs, I suppose. It is interesting to note, though, that perceived risk of use is less than 50%, meaning less than 50% of high school students, seniors that is, who are surveyed about the use of these drugs reported that there's great risk of using amphetamines once or twice. And this may result from the fact that there are a number of people who maybe you know, or certainly people I know, who take amphetamines or similar drugs for treatments of conditions like ADHD. Which I'll actually talk about a little bit later. So maybe if you yourself use these drugs for medical purposes, or if you have friends who are given prescriptions for medical purposes, maybe it seems to you that, well, there's not that much risk associated with using them. Perhaps that relatively low sense of risk accounts for the kind of relatively high percent of people who will use, or at least who will report using the drug. If we shift over to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, the last data I could find was from 2013. But if we look at stimulants among people who are 12 years old or older, so the basic general population, and if we restrict ourselves to stimulants that include amphetamines but don't include cocaine, because we talked about them last time, we see that maybe the lifetime the percentage of people who will report having ever used stimulants in their lifetime is maybe around 8%. So that's actually not that different from what we saw in Monitoring the Future. And you can see that for most of those people, they'll report having used it at some point more than a year ago. If you ask, have you used the drug in the last year, it's maybe a little less than 1%. And if you ask, have you used the drug in the last 30 days, are you a current user of stimulants, it's maybe 0.5% of the population will report that they are using these drugs. So you have a sense, I hope, of the prevalence of use of stimulants, especially amphetamines. They are not massively used among the population, at least not as compared to what was the case in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even the 1970s in our country, but they're out there, and they're somewhat more frequently used than are the other big drug in the stimulant group, that is cocaine. Now, before finishing up talking about current use of amphetamines, I want to address two quick points. One is the question, what about MDMA? MDMA is 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, which you may be familiar with by the acronym MDMA or the street names ecstasy or Molly. As you see from its name, it is a form of methamphetamine, or it's kind of a synthesized or derived from methamphetamine, and it is sometimes grouped as a stimulant because when you take MDMA you experience increased energy, increased alertness, increased kind of activation of your body and your mind. And so it's sometimes grouped in with stimulants. However, it is a drug that also influences the emotions and influences kind of the way people perceive the environment around them. And those effects are different, at least somewhat so, than the effects which we typically associate with amphetamines and other stimulants. So I and a lot of people group MDMA in with the hallucinogens. It's not quite so hallucinogenic as some of the other hallucinogens, but it seems to fit a little bit with that group more than it does with the stimulant group. So I'll talk about MDMA a little bit later, not in today's lecture. Another question you might have, or another point you might have, is about bath salts. Now, if you think back to way early in the semester, I did talk briefly about bath salts. Bath salts are an odd group of drugs which are sold semi-legally in different places in the country. They're given the name bath salts or similar kind of weird, kind of innocuous sounding names to disguise the fact that they're drugs, and they're often advertised with labels saying not for human consumption to give the appearance that the manufacturers are telling you to, I don't know, pour the stuff into your bath the next time you're taking a bath, or pour it into your the plants that you're growing in your garden. Some of them are advertised as plant food. What they are usually synthetic cathinones. Cathinones are a group of chemicals that are found in the Catha edulis, or cat plant. Cat is a plant which grows in Africa and other places, and which has been chewed, kind of like the coca leaf, has been chewed by native, indigenous peoples and people native to those regions for hundreds, if not thousands of years, to provide kind of a mild stimulant effect. So there's plenty of evidence and record of people using the cat plant a little bit like people would use coca leaves. In more recent times in history, clever chemists and pharmacologists have been able to extract cathinones from the cat plant and then later ultimately just make synthetic versions of those molecules in the laboratory. The chemical structure of most of these molecules is pretty similar to amphetamines, which probably explains why they work in roughly the same way. They seem to affect the nervous system in ways that are similar to those of amphetamines and other stimulants, and so for that reason we usually group them in with stimulants. Now that said, we don't have a lot of evidence or a lot of data on how commonly they are being used. The Monitoring the Future data set recently, and I think recently meaning within the last couple of years, started asking high school students about whether or not they'd ever used bath salts or similar types of drugs, and looking at that data, maybe 1 or 2% of students will report having ever used these drugs. It's less clear how commonly they are used in the regular population, although if you've been paying any attention to news in the last couple of years, you've probably seen some kind of exciting and lurid news stories about people who've engaged in bizarre behavior, supposedly while under the influence of bath salts. There is from the Dawn network, that if you think back to the beginning of the semester, records hospital admissions from drug use. There's a fairly large number of people in the last year or two have been admitted to hospital emergency rooms suffering adverse effects that seem to have to do with their use of bath salts. Although a little bit like with other kind of new semi-legal synthetic drugs, it's not always clear exactly what's in the mixture that the person snorted or dissolved into water and drank. So we're not honestly even always sure what the person was taking that then made them feel sick and brought them into the emergency room. So anyway, that's a little bit about the current use of amphetamines and other stimulants, but mostly amphetamines. Let's move on a little bit and talk about the pharmacology of these drugs. Well, I'm not going to talk a great deal about the pharmacology because in some respects it's a lot like cocaine. The general pattern of how the drug absorbs into the body is pretty similar, although there's greater variability among amphetamines because they're just different types of amphetamines, and they have somewhat different pharmacological profiles, each individual and distinct from the other. And within the framework of this lecture, I don't really have the time or frankly the inclination to go into all the nitty-gritty details about all the different ways that different types of amphetamines are absorbed into the body. But for our purposes, let's just say that it's similar to what we see with cocaine. Amphetamines, as I already mentioned earlier in this lecture, are water soluble, which means they're pretty easily absorbed into the body. They can be consumed through the stomach, or consumed through the mouth and absorbed through the stomach. For instance, if you're taking medication in pill form, there are some people who will crush up amphetamines and snort them, kind of like you would with cocaine, so they're being absorbed through the nasal membranes. You can vaporize some amphetamines, particularly methamphetamine, and inhale it. And then there's, of course, some people who will dissolve the drug into water and inject it. And that's about as much as I'm going to say because, again, it's pretty similar in terms of the pharmacology to cocaine. There are a couple little twists that I'll point out in just a few more slides. But in order to get there, I want to shift to talking about the acute effects of amphetamines. What goes on in your body, what goes on in your brain when you're taking these drugs? Well, again, a lot of it is like cocaine, and that makes sense because amphetamines, like cocaine, are grouped together as stimulants. One difference, though, is that there's a longer half-life for amphetamines than there are for cocaine. So again, it's variable depending on what type of amphetamine we're talking about, but whereas the half-life for cocaine may be an hour or so, the half-life of amphetamines, especially methamphetamines, can be much, much longer. And what that translates to is, generally speaking, longer effects of the drug. So if someone takes cocaine, they may experience kind of the peak level that drug affects them within about 20 or 30 minutes, and after that time it's mostly out of their system. If you think back to the last lecture, smoking crack or smoking freebase cocaine had an even shorter sort of trajectory of its effect. In the case of amphetamines, as variable as they may be, those effects can last a lot longer. And this has an interesting consequence in terms of the way people use these drugs. In the case of cocaine, people typically binge on the drug, meaning that even if they kind of want to save some of the drug for later, they'll typically use as much of it as they have until it's all gone. So there are plenty of clinical accounts of this, or even anecdotes. I can recall hearing friends of mine in college who used cocaine describing buying cocaine on Friday and thinking that they would use some on Friday night and then save some for later in the future, and pretty much using all of it on Friday night until it was gone. In fact, friends of mine told a very interesting story about how they went to a party and someone had cocaine there, and so everyone started using cocaine, and then almost immediately, of course, it was gone, and 10 minutes later, everyone was looking at each other saying, who do we know who has more cocaine? Who can we call? And everyone got on their cell phones and started calling up people to try and get more cocaine. Years later, when I was a clinician working with people who had addictions, including addictions to cocaine, I heard very similar stories. And I think it kind of generally underlines this idea that the ride from cocaine is pretty quick, and you typically want to get back on that ride really fast, and you'll do it as much as you can until you've run out. In the case of amphetamines, we see a different pattern of use. The effects last longer. Again, it depends on which type of amphetamine we're talking about. So people typically will just use every couple of hours or every few hours, but maybe for really long periods of time. Again, there are kind of interesting anecdotal accounts of people using amphetamines to stay awake for days at a time, whether they're writers or artists. If you kind of like classic rock music and classic country music, you may have read some of the accounts of Johnny Cash, staying up for days at a time, writing music and playing with his band while taking amphetamines. So we see a kind of a more protracted pattern of use for people under amphetamines than we do under cocaine, at least typically speaking. So again, with that in mind, what are the effects that we see for this drug? In the peripheral nervous system, the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activation is tilted much in the direction of sympathetic activation, and this is much like we saw with cocaine. If you think back to a few slides ago, I had a picture of a young man with very dilated pupils. I picked that picture just to highlight one of the symptoms or one of the effects that we see from stimulant use in the periphery, and that is dilation of the pupil. You can see that on this chart right here, but we'd see other effects as well. Obviously things like increased heart rate, increased respiration, inhibited digestion. Again, this is why people who are on amphetamines tend to not be very hungry, and they have decreased appetite and maybe lose weight as a result, and so on and so on. Just to highlight a few of those, increased heart rate, increased respiration, increased blood pressure and body temperature, things like that, increased levels of energy as well. So generally speaking, like with cocaine, when people are taking amphetamines, they have kind of, in terms of their overall physiology, a sense of being revved up a bit. And as with cocaine, if we look in the central nervous system, we see a general pattern of increased activity sort of across the different regions and systems of the brain. So this is more or less the same thing I said with cocaine. The subjective differences between a cocaine high and an amphetamine high, I'm sure we could find sources that would attempt to parse them, but they're pretty similar. The big difference, or a big difference, is just the time course. The effects last longer for most amphetamine uses than they do for most cocaine uses. Like cocaine, amphetamines work mostly by acting on the monoamine systems, especially dopamine and norepinephrine systems. And the reason they do so is that they have a chemical structure which is fairly similar to those of the neurotransmitters in this group. So again, if you've taken a chemistry class, this may be kind of obvious to you, but even if you haven't, just simply looking at the little schematic diagrams for dexedrine and methamphetamine in the top there, you can see that they're pretty similar to the chemical structures represented by the schematics for dopamine and norepinephrine. And this explains to us kind of a little bit about how these drugs work. In the central nervous system, they work to stimulate the release of these neurotransmitters, and they help to block their reuptake. The drugs themselves can activate the receptors that normally get activated by dopamine and by norepinephrine. So we see kind of increased activity in brain systems that use dopamine and norepinephrine, and other neurotransmitters as well, but principally those two as their neurotransmitters. So that's kind of a little bit about how the drug works in the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system in terms of its acute effects. Let's briefly talk about some of the chronic effects of the drug. Here is a picture from a public service advertisement from the Montana Meth Project. This was a few years ago. They had a series of ads called The Faces of Meth to kind of highlight the potentially devastating long-term effects of methamphetamine use by showing people how they changed in their mugshots over the years as their use of methamphetamine continued. And there's reason to believe that there are a lot of bad things that can go on in your life if you use methamphetamines or amphetamines, including methamphetamine, heavily and without good supervision for long periods of time. As we saw with cocaine, there's some physical damage that can take place in your body. You really strain your cardiovascular system, putting you at greater risk for all sorts of negative events like heart attack or just inflammation of the heart tissue, increased risk of stroke, and other problems like that. As with cocaine, there are long-term psychological effects which can take place. We can diagnose someone with amphetamine psychosis, which is similar to cocaine psychosis. It's a kind of a pattern of or syndrome of psychological symptoms that can occur when someone's used amphetamines in high amounts for long periods of time, and can include symptoms like paranoia and physical hallucinations, a lot like we saw with cocaine. Also depression and anxiety. Sometimes this has the appearance of kind of like an obsessive compulsive kind of a syndrome where someone gets very can get very anxious and can repeat stereotypic behaviors like checking their keys or checking to see that they've turned the oven off or anything else like that, little rituals that seem to help them manage their anxiety. That can occur in people who've used amphetamines for long periods of time. So a variety of bad things can go wrong if you use amphetamines. In case you were thinking about doing it, consider this the public service announcement portion of the lecture. But as we often can consider when we think about drugs, it's not all bad. There are some uses for stimulants. So I want to talk briefly about the medical uses of stimulants. What can we do with these drugs that can be useful for folks? One of the most important uses of stimulant medications is for treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. You've almost certainly heard of this condition. It's diagnosed in maybe 3 to 5% of school-age children. It's somewhat more common in boys than in girls, and its symptoms can persist into adulthood. Again, you almost certainly know someone who has this diagnosis, or maybe you yourself do. If you somehow missed out on this, it's a condition which can include, as the name suggests, difficulty sustaining attention when doing tasks like going to school or working at your job, and general hyperactivity, difficulty sitting still, difficulty kind of persisting at a task without stepping up and moving on to do something else. And while it's it's not common, but while it can be diagnosed in children, there is evidence that it can persist into adulthood. So there are adults out there who suffer from some of these symptoms as well. And what's important for today's lecture is to note that stimulant medications are a very effective treatment for ADHD. They don't take away all the problems, but for most people they can be, at least when prescribed properly and when managed properly, they can be an effective treatment. So if we look at these drugs which are commonly prescribed for ADHD, we see things like dexedrine, which we've encountered already. Adderall is an amphetamine. Ritalin is an amphetamine-like stimulant, and Concerta, which you sometimes see, is just a time-release formulation of amphetamine to kind of sustain the effects over longer periods of time so that people have good management of their symptoms. So it's interesting to ask why stimulants work for ADHD. It at least initially might seem somewhat counterintuitive that a child who's already kind of hyperactive would benefit from taking a drug which ought to make them feel more energetic. But it's been theorized that what stimulants do is they increase dopamine activity, especially in the frontal regions of the brain, in the frontal cortex, that may help to amplify the environment signal to noise ratio. I mean, what I mean by that is, imagine you're a child, you're sitting in class, you're trying to pay attention to the teacher or the lecturer. It's an experience you've almost certainly had yourselves, and it can be difficult to pay attention to what's important in that environment when there are a lot of other things which are not important but distracting. So, how do you sustain your attention on the teacher in the front of the room when your friend sitting next to you is doing something stupid and amusing? How do you pay attention to the lecturer in the front of the hall when the people sitting around you are looking at their cell phones or their tablets? Increased activity in dopamine systems in the frontal cortex may help to sort of fire up those executive functions, give you better ability to choose what's important to do in your environment and focus on just that. It can also just generally increase your motivation, so you feel more drive to do the thing that's important to do, whether it's paying attention in class or working on your homework or whatever else. This again has a lot to do with the way we think the dopamine systems in the frontal cortex work, although different medications which are given for ADHD often work on not just dopamine but other monoamines, for instance norepinephrine. So we're not exactly sure why these drugs work, but they do seem to work for most people when prescribed properly and when managed properly. There are side effects from these medications, as there are from all medications. In particular, when we look at children who are treated with stimulants for ADHD, we see evidence of suppression of height and weight gains. The kids don't, frankly, grow on track as well as their peers who are not taking these medications. Interestingly, we see that there are some catch-up can occur when people are taken off the drug. So if you have a child who's taking stimulant medications during the school year for ADHD, but then over the summer his parents and his doctor withdraw him from that treatment, he'll get a certain amount of catch-up in terms of weight gain and height gain if he's still growing. Another side effect, well, in a sense, is just simple withdrawal. If we have children, or adults for that matter, taking stimulant medications for ADHD, when we withdraw them from treatment, we see a withdrawal syndrome that looks kind of the opposite of the major drug effect. So instead of having lots of energy, the person has less energy, and instead of having a lot of motivation, they have less motivation, and they may even suffer from symptoms of depression. So it's tricky to properly prescribe and manage the use of these medications, although they can be helpful for some folks. How to decide if you're a parent, if your child needs these medications, assuming that you answer yes to that question, which medications to choose and how to best administer them can be a tricky thing. In the best of all situations, doctors and parents work together to get a treatment program that is most effective while minimizing some of these side effects or negative consequences. One thing people also sometimes ask about is whether using medications like this increases risk for using other drugs in the future, particularly illegal drugs. You might imagine that if a child gets used to taking stimulant medications for ADHD early on in his life, he might be tempted to use cocaine later on in life. There actually doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for that. In fact, the evidence almost works in the opposite direction. If children are properly treated for ADHD with stimulant medication, they tend to do better in school. They tend to be less have less problems of becoming socially deviant and hanging out with the wrong crowd and starting to experiment with drugs. They're more successful and better to avoid using drugs, better able to avoid using drugs in the future rather than getting into drugs. So again, when the drugs are properly managed and administered, they can decrease the risk for later drug problems. However, when they're not properly administered and managed, they can increase risk. So there are examples, and you can find these on YouTube, and you can read about these clinically, of people who use or who misuse and who abuse their prescription medications by, for instance, crushing them up and snorting them, or using a lighter to burn them and inhale the smoke and vapor. When you're using these drugs as they weren't intended, typically to get a stronger, faster high, you do increase the risk for addiction to both stimulant medications and to other drugs as well later on in life. So it's never simple in the world of drugs. There are benefits to using stimulants. There are also risks as well. A lot of it has to do with how they're used over time. Okay, so that's a lot of information. I just want to finish up with a couple points related to treatment, what we do for people who do develop problems with addiction or dependence on stimulant drugs, whether they're medications or whether they're cocaine or other street drugs. As we saw with other quick looks at treatment, there are some behavioral options. Just generally speaking, counseling or different forms of therapy can help clients to plan for how to cut down or even quit their use of a drug, and whether it's cocaine or whether it's abusing Adderall or whatever else, and help them to manage their relapse if they do relapse into using. There are different forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a specific type of psychotherapy which are used for people who are addicted to stimulants. Often this form of therapy involves helping people learn to recognize cues in their environment that trigger craving and then avoid or manage their exposure to those cues, and also helping people recognize thoughts that they're having which encourage their use of drugs like cocaine, like other stimulants, and then teaching people to refrain their thoughts. That is, take a thought which is encouraging you to use and change it around in your mind so that it acts to discourage you from using drugs. So cognitive behavioral therapy is used for other forms of treatment, for other forms of dependence, but there is a fair bit of CBT for stimulant addiction. And part of the reason that there's a lot of interest in using CBT and other forms of behavioral therapy or counseling is because there are currently no FDA-approved medications for treatment of stimulant addiction. So if you're addicted to cocaine, or you're addicted to amphetamine or methamphetamine or whatever else, there aren't a lot of good medications that your doctor or a psychiatrist can give you that will be helpful. There's a lot of interest in this area, and there are some medications that show promise, but as of today, 2015, the last time I checked the FDA website, there are no approved medications for treatment. One drug which shows some promise, and I just want to highlight it because I find this very interesting, is our friend disulfiram, or antabuse. You'll recall, hopefully, that this is a drug which disrupts the metabolism of alcohol and makes someone who's taken antabuse and then also drunk alcohol very sick. And so the idea is, if you know you're going to get really sick from drinking alcohol because you took antabuse, then you're going to feel less encouraged. You're going to feel discouraged from using alcohol, and it can help you maintain your abstinence. It turns out that antabuse actually disrupts the metabolism of dopamine. So remember, back in the synaptic cleft between one neuron and another, neurotransmitters are released, they activate receptors, and then they get kind of recycled. There's a series of metabolic processes that break them down so they can be reused again. Well, antabuse disrupts dopamine metabolism, which means the excess dopamine builds up and doesn't so much make the person feel high, but makes them feel really anxious or restless in an uncomfortable way. So if you're taking antabuse and you then relapse into using cocaine or relapse into using methamphetamine, it'll make you feel pretty bad. And that may be the mechanism that helps discourage people from using the drug. Again, this isn't, at least not last time I checked, FDA approved, but it's something that there is some research in, and there seems to be some promise that this may help treatment as well. So that's it as far as treatment goes. Again, there's not a lot out there, at least not a lot that I can tell you. And that kind of brings us to the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about sedative drugs. That'll be kind of a short lecture, probably a one-off lecture. But for the time being, I want to thank you for your attention in this lecture and in the last one. As I always say, thanks for your attention. I appreciate it. If you have questions or comments, please let me know. Put them in the comment section of YouTube. Put them in the discussion boards on Blackboard. I'll do my best to respond to them. I'll also link to some other interesting information and websites, including some video clips about treatment with CBT for stimulant addiction. So hopefully you'll find that interesting as well. But again, that's it for now, and thanks for your attention one last time, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.